Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final installation of the 2021-22 season for the Alworth Center for Peace and Justice Lecture Series at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. From wherever you may be listening, thank you again for joining us. My name is Tim Lorick. I'm an assistant professor of history here at the College of St. Scholastica. As I mentioned when we last met in February, our longtime director, Dr. Tom Morgan, now retired, has passed the baton to me, and I am grateful for all of his work that he's done for this series over the years and his assistance with this transition. Again, Tom is joining us from his home in Duluth. So hello, Tom, and thank you again for your leadership and vision with this series. Our program tonight features Kim Ghattas, who will speak to us about the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Her talk is entitled Lessons from the Middle East, Misconceptions, Rivalries, and Waves of Change. We regret that we are once again hosting this series in virtual format due to the logistical complications and public health concerns of the ongoing pandemic, but we are grateful to Kim for her flexibility and our tech team for their guidance. We're also grateful to you, our audience, near and far, for your understanding and continuing interest during these complicated times. Now, before introducing Kim and beginning the lecture, I'd like to run through a few short housekeeping details. First, as always, we'd like to pause to thank our generous donors, first and foremost, the Alworth family. This series is also possible thanks to funding from the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Ivre Foundation and the Mary C. Van Ivre Foundation Endowed Fund in memory of William Van Ivre. Additional support comes from the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, Reader Weekly, Duluth Sister Cities International, the League of Women Voters of Duluth, the Royal D. Alworth Jr. Institute for International Studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and other private donors. Speaking of the Alworth Institute at UMD, this year's series has been a joint collaboration between our two programs on the theme, The World Beyond Our Borders. The final two lectures in this series are scheduled to take place at the University of Minnesota Duluth. The next event on April 5th at 7 p.m. will feature Dr. Raymond Gilpin, Chief Economist and Head of Strategy at the Regional Bureau for Africa at the United Nations Development Program. The final event will feature Thomas Hansen, UMD Alworth Institute Diplomat in Residence and retired Foreign Service Officer for the U.S. State Department. Tom Hansen's talk is entitled The United States and the World Outside Our Borders, Challenges, Opportunities, and Fateful Contradictions. This event is scheduled to be in hybrid mode on Tuesday, April 12th at 7 p.m. Please check the UMD website for more information and updates at alworth.org. After the lecture tonight, we will hold a question and answer session with our speaker. Feel free to submit questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. After the lecture, I will moderate the questions and filter them to our speaker. Now, on with the lecture. Kim Ghattas is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and a non-resident senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is the author of Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. Published in 2020 and available at our local Fitkers bookstore here in Duluth. Black Wave is a New York Times notable book of 2020 and has received numerous other accolades. She's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Secretary, A Journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the Heart of American Power. Ghattas has worked as a journalist, reporting for 20 years for the BBC, as well as the Financial Times and most recently, The Atlantic, among others. Kim, thank you again for joining us, and now over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim, for this introduction. Thank you for having me for this lecture. Thank you to Tom, who first reached out to me last year already when we were planning this lecture. I'm really delighted to be with you this evening. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I hope that I'll have another opportunity to come and visit you on campus. It's really wonderful to speak as part of this series that has taken you around the world. I love the overall theme of the world beyond our borders. I come from beyond the borders of America, of course. I happen to be in Washington, D.C. at the moment, but usually home is Beirut, where I was born and raised. And growing up in Lebanon during the Civil War, I took a keen interest in trying to not only understand what was happening around me, but try to explain it to others beyond the borders of Lebanon as well. And that's why I opted to become a journalist and eventually an author. So I love having the opportunity to interact, and I look forward to your questions from all of you at the end of my talk. I'm going to start sharing my screen. We have a PowerPoint slide that I'll be using just as a bit of assistance in the background. It doesn't have too much text. It's really more in the sense of a TED Talk style. I don't like too much text, but I like to give my audience a bit of a flavor, a bit of a visual of what I'm talking about, so that I can transport you to some of these places that I'm talking about, or some of these moments in time that I'll be describing. My talk is titled, as Tim said, Lessons from the Middle East. Misconceptions, rivalries, and waves of change. And when we talk about the Middle East, very often we're very focused on what happens within the confines of countries or the region itself. But I like to think that we're all very interconnected in this world. And today we cannot talk about anything without mentioning Ukraine, for example. And you'll ask me, what's the connection between Ukraine and the Middle East? What's the connection between Ukraine and Lebanon or Egypt or Syria? There are many connections, and I am going to show you in a moment what they are. But at the onset, the real connection is that we're all concerned by events that happen across the world, because sometimes, unbeknownst to us, they have a ripple effect all the way back to us. I was, as I said, I grew up in Lebanon, and next door to Lebanon, of course, is Syria, with its capital, Damascus. And as some of you may know, Syria has been in conflict over the last 11 years, and it started in 2011 with a peaceful uprising against a dictatorship. But the way it unfolded, the way it unfortunately often unfolds with peaceful uprisings against a dictatorship, is that it descends into violence. And the destruction in Syria has been really awful and disheartening and quite painful to watch when you're sitting in Lebanon. It's a conflict that did not make many headlines for too long in the Western world, but it is one that is coming to the fore again. Because as you'll see from this first picture in my PowerPoint's presentation, you'll see two pictures side by side of the destruction in Ukraine today and the destruction in Syria just from a few years ago. Look at what war can do to a country. In just an instant, these were apartment blocks that were being lived in by people whose lives were unfolding in many ways as your lives may be unfolding. And this imagery is a clear visual of how fragile our societies can be, of how fragile peace can be. But the desire for a better world, for more justice, for more rights, for dignity is one that unites people from Syria to Ukraine. And you can see that this picture, which was taken in Syria some time ago, shows a flag of the Syrian opposition. The green line, the black line with the three stars, is a flag that the Syrian opposition to the dictator Bashar al-Assad has been using, and it's side by side with a flag of Ukraine in support for the fight for freedom against the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And why are Syrians thinking about Ukraine? Well, because their own dictator, Bashar al-Assad, has received a lot of support from one man, Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, saw that it was in his interest to support Bashar al-Assad, another autocrat, as he tried to quash the opposition to his dictatorship in Syria. So since 2015, Vladimir Putin has been assisting with terrible use of military force. He has been assisting Bashar al-Assad in his efforts to remain on top of the leadership of his country. And you saw from the previous pictures and from this picture, the immense damage that artillery shelling and air raids cause to the cities. Cities, you know, if I didn't say that it was Syria, you could think that it was Kyiv today, or Mariupol, or Kharkiv. And you see that within just the span of 20 days of war, the picture on the one side, August 2021, shows apartment blocks, residential buildings, where people had been living, you know, the forest behind, where people were probably going for a walk. And just immediately, you'll see March 2022, just within a few weeks, the utter devastation that can be wrought by war. This is Kharkiv station, as hundreds, if not thousands of people are trying to flee. These are refugees who have been welcomed in the rest of Europe, who are trying to flee for their life, to try to take with them whatever they can, but mostly they've been fleeing with almost nothing. They've been getting on trains and crossing the border and going to places like Poland or Germany or the UK, wherever they can go. And they have been mostly welcomed with open arms. But it's not always the case for refugees to be opened with welcome arms. As you'll see, this picture, it could be actually anywhere. I'm the one telling you that it's in Kharkiv, but it really reminded me of the exodus out of Kabul just last summer, when US troops withdrew in August, and people desperate to flee the advance of the Taliban went to the airport in Kabul, and many of them managed to get on American flights out of the country, fleeing the same kind of violence that Ukrainians are facing. It just takes a different form, but it is an oppressive kind of violence. It is a kind of intolerance that pushes people who are looking for dignity and justice out of their countries. The coverage of these events, whether it's the war in Syria or the refugee crisis from Syria, whether it's Afghanistan and the evacuation from Kabul, whether it's, you know, refugees coming from other countries, has been covered very differently than the refugee crisis that the war, the invasion of Ukraine has caused. And this is one newspaper opinion piece that was published, which was really quite striking. It was published in the Telegraph, and the author says, the refugees out of Ukraine, this is what he's referring to, they seem so like us. This is what makes this so shocking. Ukraine is a European country. Its people watch Netflix, they have Instagram, and they have Instagram accounts, they vote in free elections and read uncensored newspaper. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations. The idea that war only happens over there in countries like Syria, like Iraq, like Afghanistan. And it was something that was repeated several times by others, including on television. Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe. These are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from Ukraine. They're Christian, they're white, they're very similar. The problem with some of these statements are not so much that you can think that they're racist, that they are diminishing the pain of people who don't look like you, but are from countries that you think are different. it denotes a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, about world history, because it's important to remember that one of the worst conflicts in recent history was actually in Europe, and it was World War II. And it's not that long ago. And now we're seeing again a terrible conflict happen in Europe with rapid devastation and ferocious violence deployed by Vladimir Putin on European soil. The other thing that these statements seem to ignore is that nothing ever stays only in the Middle East. Nothing ever stays only in Ukraine or Russia. Putin's actions in Syria went unpunished, even though he could be accused of war crimes in Syria as well, just the way that President Joe Biden today is saying that Vladimir Putin might be accused of war crimes for the actions of his army in Ukraine. Nothing ever stays in the Middle East. Everything is interconnected. It's just that because of recent events in the Middle East, we've been very focused on what happens within this region and what emanates from that region and how it reverberates to the rest of the world. This is what has dominated the more recent headlines about conflict, because this is what we've been seeing over the last few decades, 2 or 3 or 4 decades. Although actually I should even correct myself that we should not forget the conflict in Bosnia and Serbia in the 90s. But my talk is about the Middle East and the misconceptions we have that emanate from how we view the region. And as you see, one of the misconceptions is that refugees can only be from Syria or Iraq or perhaps Africa, because why would they be from a stable region? And as I said, it denotes a lack of context for how conflicts happen. It denotes a misconception about how fragile peace and democracy are anywhere. But if we focus on the Middle East itself, and what are the misconceptions about the region itself, I'll get to that in a moment. I'm very focused on the misconceptions that focus on Saudi Arabia and Iran. And those two countries today are represented by Mohammed bin Salman, mostly, the Crown Prince, with the red headgear. He is, of course, still only Crown Prince, and the leader of the country is the King Abdullah. And Iran is really, the power in Iran is really in the hands of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, with the black turban. But let me go to some of the misconceptions about the region, and particularly about the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. There are 3 misconceptions about the region. One is that Saudi Arabia and Iran have always been enemies. The other is that sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shias has always been the norm. And the final one is that the region has always been defined by cultural and religious intolerance. Let us break those down. Have Saudi Arabia and Iran indeed been enemies forever? And are they therefore bound to be enemies forever? I'll take you back to the 60s, when you had the Shah of Iran, who was still ruling at the time before he was overthrown. And you see these headlines from the New York Times, where the Shah of Iran is off to visit King Saud of Saudi Arabia, where the Shah of Iran and the Saudi king working together for Gulf cooperation. And even a headline in the Jerusalem Post stating that Iran is always with the Arabs, and they're quoting the Shah. So there was a time when Saudi Arabia and Iran were not at each other's throat as they are today. There was a time when the rulers of these two countries, even though one country is dominantly Sunni, Saudi Arabia, and one country is dominantly Shia, Iran, even though they have these different sectarian denomination as a majority, they could work together. And even more, here there's a picture of the Shah of Iran, the tall man standing with his hands out. praying in Mecca during the pilgrimage, the yearly pilgrimage. And they even had intelligence cooperation in something that was called the Safari Club. It's a nice name, and it comes from the place where they were meeting in Kenya. And this was a covert alliance of intelligence services that was formed in 1976 and which ran clandestine operations around Africa at the time when, for various reasons, because of what was happening in Latin America, Congress had limited the powers of the CIA for covert work. And the formal members of this club were Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and France. So Saudi Arabia and Iran were not just allies, they were not just visiting each other, they were not just calling each other nice names, they were actually working together on essential issues like intelligence. And as I've already mentioned, one country is dominantly Sunni and one country is dominantly Shia. And yet they were able to work together. And even more so, they were allies in what was then the effort by the US to push back against the Soviet Union. Remember, this was the Cold War in the 60s and the 70s. And Saudi Arabia and Iran were twin pillars in US policy to counter the Soviet Union and communism in the region. And so I think you have the answer to the second misconception, which is that were Sunnis and Shias always killing each other, as we've seen in recent headlines coming out of Iraq, coming out of Pakistan, coming out of Afghanistan? Has this always been the norm? Now, of course, for those of you who know the history, Sunnis and Shias, like Catholics and Protestants, have a historical schism at the heart of their religion. And it comes from the days following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of the religion, and a dispute about who was the heir to his legacy. Was it his closest relative or was it his closest confidant? And the Sunnis believe it was his closest confidant, and the Shias insist it was his closest relative. And so you have had over time, certainly in the immediate aftermath of the Prophet Muhammad's death, you had a civil war between those two factions. They were not quite defined as Sunnis and Shias just yet. It's a fluid identity that evolved over time. And you have had episodes over time of some violence between them. But there is this idea which President Obama mentioned during his State of the Union address in January of 2016, where he said, in today's world, we're threatened less by evil empires and more by failing states. He's true about that. He's correct about that. And at the time, he said the Middle East is going through a transformation that will play out for a generation, rooted in conflicts that date back millennia. Now, we can either agree that all conflicts date back centuries, including what we're seeing play out in Ukraine today with Vladimir Putin's desire to recreate the great Soviet Empire or even go further back in time. And then perhaps we can have a discussion about why it's inevitable that Sunnis and Shias would again kill each other. Or we can say that we are not defined by our past and that there is a different way forward, and accept that Sunnis and Shias have not always killed each other, and that this caricature that is portrayed in the media of Sunnis and Shias always being at each other's throat is incorrect. Now, again, I want to repeat that the sectarian identities are there, but it's only very recently that the violence has risen to these levels. If you go back in history, you can go back to approximately the 16th century and find that there was violence between the Ottoman Empire, which preceded the Turkish modern state, and the Safavid Empire, which ruled today's modern Iran. And they were both Sunnis at the time. They both mostly ascribed to Sunnism. But the Safavids thought it would be convenient to use religion to differentiate themselves from the Ottomans. And so they converted, almost by force, most of their population to Shia Islam so that they could better rally people around the flag and differentiate and delineate the border between these two fighting powers. And what were they fighting about? They were fighting about territory. And that's what most wars are, of course, about. And of course, sectarianism is not only found in the Middle East. I take you to Northern Ireland, where the war or the violence between Catholics and Protestants has bedeviled Belfast and Northern Ireland for dozens, if not hundreds of years. And I would argue that over the course of history, Catholics and Protestants have killed each other as much, if not more, than Sunnis and Shias. It's just that today, these, or in more recent days, because right today, there's less about Sunnis and Shias killing each other, and there's more focus, of course, today on Ukraine. But in the last couple of decades, the focus, the headlines have been very much about sectarianism and sectarian violence in the Middle East. But I always read to this day about eruption of violence between Catholics and Protestants. And I know from having visited Belfast that it's very hard for young Catholics and young Protestants to interact with each other and go to school together. They are often separated in different schools, and there's not much interaction between them. Whereas you will find, and of course I'm generalizing a little bit, you will find a lot of people in the Muslim world very proud that they interact and intermarry. And when you're a Sunni and you marry a Shia, we have, there's a little inside joke to say that, I'm a Sushi, I'm Sunni Shia, so I am Sushi. And it's not uncommon. And even in Beirut, for example, I live across the street from a Christian school, and I can see a lot of young Muslim children go there. And the reason why I know that some of them are Muslim is because their mothers are veiled when they drop them off at school. But there's no issue there. Everybody wants the best education for their children. So that takes us to the third misconception, which is that, was the Middle East always intolerant and extreme? I would, of course, say that even today, it's not a majority that is intolerant and extreme, but it is the impression that people have of this region. And I think you can guess, again, from some of what I've been saying, that if Sunnis and Shias can marry each other even today, and if Sunnis and Shias have not always been killing each other, then there must have been a time when there was less intolerance and less violence. And that is true also from a cultural and intellectual perspective. There was a time when even on the campus of Kabul University, women were free to walk in miniskirts and wearing shirts. Now, I know that the criticism of this picture in particular is that, because it's quite a famous picture, is that it shows, a moment in time on a tiny, square footage of Kabul at a university, and it shows the westernized elite. But actually, these sites were not uncommon across the region, from Egypt to Morocco, from Beirut to Baghdad. You could cycle on the banks of the river Tigris in a skirt and a shirt as a woman in the 70s. You could recite poetry in long evenings under jasmine trees in Peshawar. You could go to the movies with your girlfriends as a woman in Egypt in the 60s and 70s and not be harassed. You could be veiled if you wanted to, but you had the choice. And that's what the Middle East lost. And I want to show you some of these incredible posters of movies that were produced by the Egyptian film industry, which was one of the top 3 film industries in the world in the 60s. And of course, you can't read unless some of you know Arabic. Some of first of all, look at the imagery, the pictures, the way the women are dressed. This was mainstream cultural offering in the Middle East. These are the movies that we all grew up with, if we're of the right age. I'm not going to divulge my age here. But even some of the titles of the movies are very interesting. At the top, under the umbrella, Love in August. At the bottom, The Open Door, with the actress Fatin Hamama, who was very activist in some of the scripts she chose to act in. She wanted to effect social change. And one of the films she acted in was about a woman's right to choose for divorce. This is quite avant-garde for the whole world, actually, including in the West in the 70s, when even in the US, women still couldn't have their own credit card, and it had to be in the name of their husband. So what really happened? How did we go from those movie posters to where we are today? What happened was one particular year, which was a real turning point for the region, 1979. 1979 was a vintage year of events around the world, but in particular for the region, there were three key events. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returns to Iran in February of 1979. This is at the height of the revolution to overturn the Shah, the man who was friends with Saudi Arabia. And it was a revolution that was at the onset liberal, leftist, and progressive and nationalistic. It was about removing a dictator, an imperial despot who was an ally of America and oppressing his own people. But Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric, Shia cleric, managed to rise to the top and overtake that revolution and make it his own. And I'll get into some detail in a moment. The second event of 1979 was in November, and that was when Saudi zealots, Sunni Saudi zealots, laid siege to the holy mosque of Mecca, one of the two holy sites in Islam. And the final event of 1979 happened in December on Christmas Eve when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. So let's take a look at Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the man in the turban, at the top of the steps, coming down an Air France flight that has just brought him back to Iran after 15 years in exile. He's coming back from Paris, where he spent the last few months in exile, and where he found an opportunity and an opening to address the world after he had been in exile in Iraq, in the holy city of Najaf, thinking that he would die in obscurity. He was discovered, in essence, or rediscovered by this progressive leftist opposition that I just mentioned, who knew that they needed some of the power of religion to bring the masses into the street. And so they thought they would use him to do that. But little did they know that he was a cunning man who would end up using them and hijacking the revolution and get rid of all of them alongside his radical, deeply religious conservative acolytes who were really ruthless in how they took over not just the revolution, but the country, turning Iran into the Islamic Republic that we know to this day is still there. But this was a picture from either just before the Shah was overthrown or just after, when women were protesting on the streets of Tehran without a veil, without a chador, the black all-encompassing a shroud that many women wear in Iran today. And within days or just a few weeks of Khomeini's return to Iran, he decreed that women had to put on the veil. And if they wanted to work, if they wanted to work in a ministry, or if they wanted to do anything. And women protested. The largest protest, about 100,000 women took to the streets to protest what was for them a new kind of oppression. They thought they had gotten rid of a dictator, and suddenly they found that actually what they'd signed up for was not more freedom, but a different kind of oppression, an oppression that came with a lot of violence. So it was very difficult to undo the acts of Khomeini, and it was very difficult to undo the hijacking of this revolution. And if you remember, I mentioned that Sunnis and Shias were not always at each other's throat, and that the Shah of Iran and the King of Saudi Arabia were able to work together. And even to this day, and even right after the revolution, but also to this day, Sunnis and Shias can work together across the region when they have common interests. And the common interest that you see in this picture is the meeting between Ayatollah Khomeini and a man that some of you may recognize if you've read your history, which is Yasser Arafat wearing the keffiyeh. Yasser Arafat was a Palestinian leader, and he thought that Ayatollah Khomeini could help him regain access to Palestinian territory that had been lost when the State of Israel was created in 1948. He had hoped that Arab leaders could help him with war regain that territory, but the Egyptians lost and then signed peace with Israel. The Syrians lost, and then there was no one else to turn to because the Shah was, of course, still at the time an ally of Israel. And so Yasser Arafat, although he was a Sunni, thought that perhaps the cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, now at the head of one of the most powerful armies in the region, could help him march onto Jerusalem. And it didn't matter that one was Sunni and one was Shia. And if you fast forward to today, you'll see that Iran still provides support to Hamas, the militant organization listed as a terrorist organization by the State Department, a Sunni organization, because the Islamic Republic of Iran sees in the Palestinian cause something that it can brandish to appeal to people beyond the borders of Iran and beyond the Shia community. And then we go to the second event of that year of 1979, which was the siege of the Holy Mosque of Mecca, when the Saudis suddenly realized that they had some extremists on their hands. A very conservative country, Saudi Arabia, realized that their clerical establishment had groomed some even more conservative elements in society. And this man, Juhayman al-Utaybi, launched a siege of the Holy Mosque of Mecca, trying to demand that the House of Saud, the leaders of Saudi Arabia, the monarchs of Saudi Arabia, should become even more conservative and push out all the, what they described as infidels, push out all the Westerners from the peninsula, and also share the benefits from oil revenue more equally with the people. What happened in those two moments was not connected, but you can see there in the parallels that the rise of religion as a political power, as a political tool, is starting to emerge in a region where religion had not factored yet in the discourse. It was still about political ideologies, leftism, capitalism, pro-Soviet, pro-America. And then, of course, you have, this is still a headline about the mosque takeover, and the way the Saudis reacted, because they had seen what happened to the Shah, overtaken by the religious elements in his own country. Instead of clamping down on their own zealots, they become even more conservative and they give even more power to the religious establishment in their own country. And then, of course, we go to the third event of 1979. I'm sorry, it does say 1980 here, because that picture is actually from 1980 as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan advanced. You have these tanks coming in. What happened on Christmas Eve of 1979 is an airlift into, air arrivals into Kabul airport, and then of course they came in with their tanks. So these three events unleash something that I call the Black Wave, because what they do, even though they're not connected at the onset, what they do is they intertwine irrevocably, and they unleash dynamics where you have the rise of political Islam. Remember, theocracy has arrived to power for the first time ever in the region, in the world, actually. In the persona of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who declares himself supreme leader of Iran in 1979, and Iran becomes an Islamic republic. So even though there's a president and a prime minister and there will be a parliament, theocracy is ruling Iran. So that's the power of political Islam that suddenly surfaces. And then you have the power of militant Islam, because that's what Ayatollah Khomeini unleashes in Iran. And then as he exports his revolution outside his borders to Lebanon, to Pakistan. And militant Islam surfaces in Saudi Arabia itself. Militants take over one of the holiest sites in Islam. And then it surfaces in Afghanistan because the Saudis think we have a problem here. Our reputation as custodians of these two holy sites has been badly damaged by our inability to safeguard the mosque in Mecca. And we have a problem with these militants that we didn't know we had. So they find a way to refurbish their credentials, and two in one, they start promoting and pushing for war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. They export their own zealots to go fight the godless Soviets in Afghanistan. They start funding this war with, in cooperation with the CIA, of course, and the Pakistanis. It was the good war at the time against the Soviet in Afghanistan, but it produced the rise of militant Islam on the battlefield. And as you combine these dynamics, you unleash something, as I said, that I call the black wave, and you unleash 3 or 4 separate but intertwined dynamics. Saudi Arabia and Iran turn into mortal enemies because they're suddenly fighting on similar turf, which is religion. Iran wants to outdo Saudi Arabia as leader of the Muslim world, and they point at what happened in Mecca to say, look, you know, the Saudis, they're not good custodians of the holy sites of Islam. We should help, or we should get the international community to assist. They start exporting their revolution to Arab countries like Lebanon, promoting their vision of what Shia Islam should look like. And so the Saudis start feeling threatened as leaders of the Muslim world, particularly because they've just been undermined in that role in Mecca. And so the Saudis and the Iranians start competing against each other, and they turn into mortal enemies. And in doing so, they weaponize religion. They start using religion to push people to their camp, to rally people to their side. Religion is weaponized and sectarian identities are deployed. Because just like the Safavids and the Ottomans back in the 15th century, what's the best way to define your enemy as the other is to depict him really as the other, this monster on the other side. And so you start having really vitriolic language being deployed to describe Sunnis if you're a Shia, or to describe Shias if you're a Sunni. And that's how religion becomes weaponized. And intertwined with what's happening on the battlefield in Afghanistan, it makes for a very violent dynamic which gets unleashed across the following decades. And of course, once you start using religion and building intolerance, then you also feed cultural intolerance, and extremism begins to spread. And all of this combined means that our collective memory of this period that happened before 1979 is slowly hijacked as we sink into this black wave throughout the 80s and the 90s. And across 4 decades, I describe as the decades of war, the decades of intolerance, the decade of extremism, and the decade of revolution. And I'll take you through them very briefly because it's a whole different lecture that I could give about these 4 different decades. But in the 80s, it's the decade of war, not just in Afghanistan, but the war between Iran and Iraq, also the civil war in Lebanon, where Hezbollah, the militant group listed as a terrorist organization by the State Department, begins to rise, promoted by Iran, pushed by Iran, and armed by Iran. It's this little mini Iranian Shia state in Lebanon on the Mediterranean, and it's Iran's most successful export. And then even though the wars end in 1989, 1980, this intolerance has been planted, and it begins to appear even in peacetime in countries like Egypt and Pakistan. And eventually, of course, it erupts in a horrific fashion, not just locally against Muslims in Egypt and in Pakistan, the killing of intellectuals in Egypt, the killing of Shias in Pakistan, but of course it erupts in a violent and terrible way in a defining moment of our modern history with the attacks of 9/11, the rise of Al-Qaeda, then the invasion of Iraq unleashes some of this cauldron of sectarian hatred that had been simmering between Sunnis and Shias, and you have the worst possible sectarian violence that engulfs places like Iraq and extends into Lebanon, Syria, and even Jordan. And then, because despite all of this, what's happening across the region, there is also the dynamic of dictatorship. And some of these dictators in Egypt, but also in Jordan and elsewhere, are dictators that are keeping the peace, keeping some stability, but are backed also by America. And so you have revolutions in different countries, from Egypt to Syria to Yemen. You have some protests in Algeria and Sudan, of course, today, also in Saudi Arabia. And across these 4 decades, with local dynamics taking their own course, you have a constant, which is the Saudi-Iran rivalry. It continues to this day. It changes and evolves over time. But I ask the question, so what now? The rivalry, as I said, continues. Today, as we watch the war unfold in Ukraine, as we watch peace being signed between some Arab countries like the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel on the one side, as we watch Iran expand its role, pushing its foot soldiers in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia is also about the triangle of competition that they're in with America. Iran wanting to push America out of the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia wanting to keep America as its ally, protecting it in the region. And so America may want to retrench from the Middle East, it may want to retreat from the Middle East, but it's increasingly difficult, or it's incredibly difficult. And it's going to become increasingly difficult to disentangle yourself as a country from the region. Not that America should be involved militarily, but as you face a global challenge like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is going to be a moment where America is going to have a big tent approach and include allies. And that involves also having your allies in the region on your side, voting in support of Ukraine, for example, at the UN Security Council. That rivalry is not going anywhere for the moment, but the balancing act that the US has to do in the region also involves local actors doing their own work to reorder their own understanding of how they fit into this region. The good news is that a lot of that black wave that I was describing is receding. These are pictures from Saudi Arabia, where despite all his faults and the oppression that he has brought to his ruling style, and of course, the horrific murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in a consulate, in a Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018, Mohammed bin Salman has brought incredible social change to Saudi Arabia. These pictures would have been unthinkable even 2 years ago. These are music concerts, desert raves. You have women in tank tops, but also women still wearing the full niqab who want to enjoy the same kind of music. That social change is, I think, where we will find new energy to push forward in a different way, despite the continued oppression of autocrats. There is a different energy in the region, and even in countries like Iran. They want a different future. They want to be connected to the world, and they will find their own way to push back eventually on their own terms against what is a very oppressive regime. Today, polls show in the region that only a third of young Arabs see religion as central to their identity, and 2/3 of them want to see reforms of religious institutions. And I would like to posit that those numbers are even higher, or lower for the top number and higher for the bottom number, in Iran, where religion is not central to people's identity in the way that outsiders would think that it is. But going back to one of my starting points, you'll see that I'm trying to drive one key element here, which is to push back against misconceptions about the other, to explain how waves of change often don't stop at one border, and how we are in some ways united from Syria to Ukraine in our demands as the young generation. And I would like to still count myself as young. I'm not exactly a millennial, but we are part of a generation that understands that borders are there, but they should not separate us in our quest for dignity. And there you have, from Syria, as early as 2014, a call of support for Ukrainians who were facing a Russian invasion already then in the areas of Donbass and Luhansk on in the east of the country, on the border with Russia. So Syrians who had already tasted the ferocity of a Russian onslaught, a military onslaught, were sending, despite all their own pain, were sending a message of support to people far away in Ukraine. And today, they are still doing that, still speaking out in support of Ukrainians, and even sending advice and tips about how to push back against Russians and how to rescue people under the rubble of Russian bombing. And so I'll end with just one sentence, which I say often: there is no over there. Even when you're in the United States, separated from the rest of the world by 2 oceans, it's not that war will come here. It's not that you have to go fight there, but that it is important to understand that we are all in it together, good people fighting together for a better tomorrow that is made of common values that are based on dignity, justice, and freedom and equality. And I think that if there's one message that I would like you to take away from this, is to have a better understanding of how others outside of your country see the power of the US, the ability of the US to convene and to be part of this quest for justice and dignity. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Kim. That was great. Very informative, and I think we'll have a lively discussion. So as a reminder, we will now take questions in the Q&A bar on your screen. So I will filter those to Kim as they come in. And I think as people are typing, I just thought it might be helpful to get your perspective, thinking about the United States and thinking about maybe how we in the US maybe have a tendency to simplify other parts of the world, other relationships around the world. I wonder if you might explain your perspective on what links Putin and Assad beyond just autocracy, because I think that's the narrative we're usually given, is autocrats like autocrats. But perhaps you could start us off by telling us, from your perspective, what's behind that.
Sure. And I do want to say something about how, you said perhaps in America there's a tendency to simplify situations overseas. If it's any consolation, that's human nature everywhere. if you're sitting in the Middle East, you have a tendency to simplify what American politics are about. If you're sitting in Paris, you have a tendency to, bring down British politics to, the easiest possible understandable explanation. I think that's just how we read the world, because you can only be so involved in global affairs unless you're an expert, because you're involved with your community, your neighbors, your family. That's where you get down into the weeds and the details. And so it requires a certain desire to keep in touch with global affairs, to be able to stay on top of some of the nuance. And I'm not saying that people cannot do that, but I don't subscribe to the idea that that some people have of the United States, that people here don't understand the rest of the world. I think it's common, it's human nature, and I think if anything, it would be it's a question that we need to ask ourselves more in the frame of, does the media do a good job explaining complex stories, making it accessible without using too much jargon, without simplifying, because we think that people can't follow. Actually, I found that people can follow if you just take the time to explain it to them in ways that don't make it sound like you're a surgeon trying to explain neurosurgery to a peer, but to somebody who's a lay person. But when it comes to your question that is incredibly on point about Putin and Assad, Putin has, as any leader of a great power, or I think we could still call Russia a great power, has interests and a worldview, and also insecurities. America also has insecurities about its position on the global stage. But Putin has insecurities about what befell the Soviet Empire, what his life was like in the wake of that event, his sense that the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, was humiliated. So you take that and you combine it with his efforts to try to exert more control on his near abroad, and you combine that with the episode in Libya in 2011, when the dictator of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, was brought down not just by a popular uprising, but also by NATO action to protect civilians, which involved airplanes flying over Libya, which eventually led to his downfall because there were airstrikes against his forces. And months later, he's found in a drainage pipe and beaten to death by Libyan citizens. Putin sees that, and he makes a direct connection between Gaddafi's fate and what he describes as the treachery of the West in launching what was supposed to be limited military action, but which ends with the death of Gaddafi. And he makes a direct link between that and his own survival. And he thinks, if the West can do that to Gaddafi, using the excuse of a popular uprising, they can do that to me. And so he starts to think about what he needs to do to buffer his hold on power. And that involves invading Georgia before, of course, initially, but that involves then invading parts of Ukraine in 2014. And that involves his entry into Syria, which actually was very much helped by the United States at a time when President Obama thought, Syria, over there, not our problem. President Assad used chemical weapons against his people. It was a red line for President Obama, but he found a way not to conduct military strikes against Syria when the US and Russia made a deal to extract Syria's chemical weapons as a way to explain why the US would not strike President Assad. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that episode in 2013. But when the United States, in essence, pulled back from that moment, and again, I'm not saying that America should conduct military strikes, but if President Obama says using chemical weapons is a red line and then doesn't enforce the red line, then that gives a signal to autocrats like Bashar al-Assad, but also to Putin, that America's word is something to be negotiated. It's not always enforced. And so that provides a window for the Russians to insert themselves further into a country where they have a traditional presence already, dating back to Soviet times, when Syria was a satellite of the Soviet, not a satellite of the Soviet Union, but a satellite ally of the Soviet Union. And so President Putin uses that moment to insert himself deeper into Syria, to beef up Bashar al-Assad, who was actually on the verge of losing in the face of the popular uprising and the rebellion against him, and uses Syria as a testing ground for weapons, for disinformation, for war talk tactics, for a style of military strikes, etc. And so the interest that Putin has in Syria is tactical and practical. He has a foothold on the Mediterranean through the port of Tartus on the Mediterranean. And he has a place where his army can train and use, test weapons. And it's a place where he can test the limits of what the West will allow, because he got away with everything he did in Syria. It was complete impunity. And he was able to subvert the international institutions like the UN and veto UN resolutions on Syria, one after the other. So it's an alliance of autocrats, which for Putin was a way to signal to the West that what he was capable of, and that he thought was a way to make sure that the idea of democracy would not be appealing anymore to anyone who wanted to try that, including people in Ukraine or Georgia and even in Russia, of course.
Thank you. Yes, that's a really instructive answer. And I do want to ask more about democracy, but we have a couple of questions that I want to get to first. And the first one is kind of at a higher level, and it's thinking about not just Ukraine, but some of the other historical situations that you've described. The question is, how do you think people are able to get through tragedies like what they've gone through during these periods of war and intense state violence, perhaps? Can you reflect based on your experience as a journalist for how people get through this?
It's a very good and very important question. And I will answer it as a journalist, but also as somebody who, lived through conflict myself. I was born in the civil war in Beirut. I grew up during that civil war. I was 13 when it ended. It shaped me. It shaped my worldview. It made me want to become a journalist, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. It is something that stays with you forever. I really feel deeply and viscerally distressed for Ukrainians today, just the same way I felt for Syrians as their country was being destroyed. It's something that is very hard to explain to people who have not been through conflict, and I certainly hope no one has to ever go through that. But there is a way in which human beings are incredibly strong in their ability to overcome adversity and rebuild and deal with trauma. And people go through these experiences very differently. I have found that a lot of it has to do with the community around you. It is essential to have community to overcome trauma and heal. And I think that that's why in Lebanon, we have not had a perfect healing, but we have somehow managed to come out of our civil war experience looking and sounding somewhat normal. I have a friend who has covered wars across the region, across the world, from Bosnia to Rwanda, who came to Lebanon for the first time in 2015 at a moment of turmoil but peace. It wasn't full war. And she told me that she had never been to a country where people were so where the country was so I don't want to drop an obscenity, but she used the F word, so unbelievably crazy situation, but looking and sounding very normal. And she said she'd never seen this. And I think that because we're a small country, because we stick together, because your neighbor will help, your cousin from the village will come down to check on you, because the grocery store manager will call if he hasn't seen you in a few days, because we hang out together and we've had this common experience as a large community, a small country, we've been able to have this catharsis of talking about our experience together and almost making light of it. We almost joke about some of our experiences during the war, driving through checkpoints, almost being shot to death, dodging sniper fire to meet your girlfriend on the other side of the city, or your father who thinks, well, the best restaurant is actually on the other side of the city. I'll go there on Sunday, and I will negotiate my way through the checkpoints. And looking back, we tell these stories with almost an irresponsible lightness, but it is what makes it possible to overcome trauma. And it's been well studied that it's the ability to have community around you that makes it possible to overcome trauma. Whatever the trauma is, it can be emotional abuse in your family, it can be the isolation of a pandemic, it can be bullying at school. If you have community, you can overcome trauma to some extent, of course. Sometimes you need more emotional support and therapy. But I think often of American veterans who've come back from wars abroad and who come home to a situation of peace where no one has been through what they've been through in their immediate circle, unless they're still in contact with their fellow soldiers. And that's very often where the disconnect happens and the inability to process what you've been through happens. And that's where trauma becomes a burden that you're unable to deal with on your own. And of course, some levels of trauma, when you've seen, death in front of you, is harder to overcome. And today in Ukraine, what's keeping people going to the extent possible is the sense of solidarity from facing this experience together, their existential battle for their own country, for the survival of their country, for their rejection of occupation by Russian forces. I think that the trauma of what they've been through will only happen later, when they realize the extent of the damage and of the the ferocity of what they've experienced, the loss that they will realize. It's when people start to come back that they will find their devastated homes and their friends who are no longer there. And I think that collective trauma will be very difficult to overcome, but it's the energy of reconstruction and the ability to defy death together that will help them get through it. And it's human nature. Survival is human nature. And very often you'll find that in these moments of existential crisis, when it's life and death, it's when you really feel the importance of living to the fullest and the importance of what your existence is about. I remember when I first moved to the US in 2008 to be a State Department correspondent covering secretaries of state. You know, I lived in Lebanon my whole life. I'd only known war and then uneasy peace. I had covered conflicts from Iraq to Lebanon again in 2006. We had more war. And I needed a break from all that exhausting trauma and violence. And so I was delighted to arrive in the US and have, you know, the normality of day-to-day life where you could just wake up in the morning and go to work. But I have to say that after a year, I thought, is this it? I get up every morning and I get dressed and I maybe go to the gym, have breakfast, go to work, come back, see friends, have dinner, go to bed, go to work the next morning. It is also in our human nature to want to have purpose. And purpose is important and it needs to be personal for each one of us. But I would like all of you to think about also purpose that is greater than oneself and greater than just your immediate surroundings.
Thank you. That's a beautiful answer to a really difficult question. I think we all appreciate it. The next question is going to ask you to sort of stick with Ukraine and the invasion and the situation going on there. And again, so based on your experience and your career as a journalist, can you speculate on the war in Ukraine maybe from the vantage of the Middle East and the conflicts observed historically in the Middle East? But however you'd like to take it, can you speculate on the war in Ukraine and the potential for direct conflict between NATO and Russia, or between this escalating sort of beyond the current boundaries? And then the second part is a little more historical, and so if you feel up for it, do you consider this situation to be comparable on the international scale to something like the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I guess there's one easy way of answering that, which is no, in the sense that it's not comparable because the devastation that we're seeing in Ukraine is not something that we saw during the Cold War. That's not how things were unfolding at the time. And the violence that the Russian military, the vindictiveness, the revanchism that the Russian military is deploying in Ukraine is, I want to say is unheard of or unseen, but of course it's not, because we've seen it to some extent in Syria, and we've seen war at this scale and devastation at this scale in World War II. So I think that this moment is more dangerous and more devastating also because Putin is very isolated and he's a one-man show. During the Cold War, there was still contact between Russia and America, the red telephone or whatever it was called. There were systems in place to avoid miscalculation. There was a certain understanding even that things should not be allowed to escalate. And certainly the devastation that we're seeing in Ukraine today is shocking for the 21st century, not for Europe, but just for the 21st century. That we could see this happen again today is really devastating. It's hard to speculate, or I usually don't like to speculate too much about how things are going to unfold, or certainly not how they're going to end. But it was clear to me from the beginning that this was going to get very violent, very quickly, and very badly. And perhaps, of course, we were warned by US officials who put out all the intelligence they had about what Russia was planning in an effort to deny them the effect of surprise. The difficulty here is twofold. It is on the Western side, on the West side, on America's side, how much wherewithal does America and the West have to wait this out, because it's going to take some time. Are there going to be cracks in the unity in the Western camp when it comes to sanctions? As oil prices rise again, they went down, but if they rise again, does President Biden's calculation change about how he needs to address this if he wants the economic pain of this war not to be felt at the gas pump here and in the midterm elections in November? How do we get someone like Putin to negotiate when his view of negotiation doesn't seem to be about win-win or win-lose even? It seems to be about win or kill, right? There's this, or kill. It's sort of, there's no good way out for him here anymore. And there's no way to save face anymore either. One of the scenarios that some people are envisioning, and I don't know whether it's out of naive hope or whether they are indeed reading the tea leaves coming out of Russia and the Kremlin, is that there might be a way to bring down Putin from the inside, because his military, the oligarchs of Russia are deeply worried about where this is going, and deeply worried about the sanctions that are being imposed on Russia and what this is going to mean for the country's future, the country's economy, which has been set back, or could very quickly be set back 15 years. All the progress that was made over the last 15 years is being erased very quickly. And the longer this goes on, the harder it will be to dial back this financial crash. So there are three elements here: the internal dynamics inside Russia, the Kremlin. There is the approach of Putin and how he might be able to engage in negotiations or not. There's, of course, we shouldn't forget the Ukrainians and Zelensky, President Zelensky, and how he's trying to navigate this and what he can bring to the table and what he's willing to give up or not. I mean, after all, they are fighting for their country. And I think it's not possible to ask them to acquiesce to a ceasefire just like this, or to acquiesce to Russia's terms just like this. This is their country that they're fighting for. And then, as I said, the third element is the Western alliance. And the China element, of course, is also very interesting. How much can China stay out of this? President Biden's made clear that China should not, in his view, support Russia militarily. How much will they support in other ways? If they buy Russian oil, if they provide humanitarian support, etc. So I see this moment as a real crucial moment, an inflection point for global history in the same way that Second World War was, and in the same way that the end of the Cold War was in 1990, with the New World Order that President George Bush Sr. Declared was being ushered in with the end of the Cold War in 1990, the liberation of Kuwait, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the peace talks between Israel and its Arab neighbors for the first time. But that global order, which did serve the world really quite well, including the United States, of course, was being underwritten by the US, upheld by the US to the benefit of America and many around the world. That global order has come crashing to an end. And now we have to see whether the US can recreate a new moment where it can lead again in a new global order, which I don't know what we'll call it. I think it's still too early, to usher in a new moment where America is the leader in the face of some autocracies. That would include Vladimir Putin and China. But when it comes to the Middle East, it will have to ask some autocracies to be on America's side. And I suspect that will include Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you. Returning us a little bit to the Middle East and to Iran and especially Saudi Arabia. I'm thinking about the points that you began with and about how the situation in Ukraine and the refugee crisis, how you quoted certain news outlets as almost having a sort of tunnel vision about Ukraine, and this is this refugee crisis as though it hadn't been happening in other places. And we're in Minnesota, and Representative Ilhan Omar, among others, has recently been calling attention to Yemen. And so I'm wondering, based on your expertise in Saudi Arabia and your broader sort of view of world affairs, why should we be paying attention to Yemen?
I like to think that as human beings, we should be at least aware of other people's suffering wherever it happens. Perhaps that's something that I take away from my own experience as a child of war. I wanted the world to know what was happening in my country. And that's the big starting point for anything. I think we should care more about what happens elsewhere, because increasingly, as I said, it comes back to bite us. When it comes to Yemen, as Americans, I think it's important to care because it's a war that America acquiesced to when it first started in 2015. It's a war in which the US has given support to its partner in the region, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, as they conducted military operations in Yemen, which have also proven to be devastating for the country. That's not to ignore the role that Iran plays in its own way in Yemen, supporting the Houthi rebels there, which have been fighting against the Saudis. We should also not ignore Iran's role in Syria, where it has propped up Bashar al-Assad and meted out horrific violence as well in support of Bashar al-Assad against Syrians. So both Saudi Arabia and Iran have advanced the cause of war and devastation in the region. But when it comes to Yemen in particular, I think the unfortunate thing about Yemen is that it is not in itself very strategic for regional or international interests, not in the way that Syria is, and not in the way that Ukraine is. What matters about Yemen, if we were only to talk about a geopolitical perspective, not about a human perspective, is that it involves a country like Saudi Arabia, which is engaged in a war against the Houthis with U.S. U.S. manufactured weapons, that it is a quagmire now for Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. needs to help to find a way out of this for Saudi Arabia's sake as well, but especially for Yemenis. Because today Houthis are launching from Yemen missile attacks against Saudi Arabia, against the UAE, against trying to interdict shipping lanes in the region. That starts to have geopolitical implications beyond a localized war in Yemen. So those are the reasons why Americans should pay attention to what is happening in Yemen beyond the basic need to care about other human beings.
Of course, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Another question coming in, I think kind of going back to some of your earlier comments, from maybe your perspective in Beirut, or maybe from a perspective in a place now like Aleppo. How do people come back from sort of the physical destruction of a city? You were talking about this earlier when you were talking about Ukrainians coming back to Ukraine and how that step is sort of still to come. So how do people the question is, how do people ever hope to come back to a sense of familiarity after that sort of physical destruction?
That's such a powerful and important question. I'll answer it the best I can. I'll start by saying that it takes time. It takes time to overcome conflict. It takes time to overcome destruction. It takes time to rebuild physically, but also emotionally. It takes time to, first of all, you need to, begin by ending the conflict. Of course, that's the first step. In Lebanon, we had 15 years of civil war, and we rebuilt in between bouts of violence and bouts of shelling, but only when the war ended completely in 1990 were we able to, for example, even begin to attempt to rebuild downtown Beirut, which had been completely devastated by the war and had been turned into a no man's land. Those types of reconstructions really take time. In Lebanon, the project of rebuilding the country took off in about 91, 92. It costs a fortune, of course. There's lots of criticism of how that reconstruction took place, but that's a different story. In Syria, the war hasn't ended yet, and reconstruction of Syria is a hot topic, because who is going to rebuild it? Is it Russia with President Assad, or should the international community participate? Why should they participate when Russia destroyed half the country? Or why should they participate if Russia is still in control there? So there are political questions that also come to the fore when you're beginning to look at the reconstruction of a country. And then when it comes to Ukraine, we still don't know how it's going to end. I hope for Ukrainians that they can find a way towards fast resolution of this conflict in favor of their own sovereignty. But the reconstruction will take time. It will cost billions, and it will take time, not just in a physical way. The rebuilding of devastated cities, hospitals, the infrastructure, the power lines, the water lines, all of that is going to require probably something like a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. But the reconstruction of society, of the fabric of society, with the loss that they've endured, is going to be very painful. But they'll have, as I said, the sense of community, of having to do that together for the sake of Ukraine, to keep them going.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking at the clock, and I'm thinking that those are perhaps good words to end on. I want to thank you again for such powerful reflections on not just the Middle East and geopolitics in the Middle East and Middle Eastern history, but how lessons from the Middle East and misconceptions about the Middle East might inform how we think about other conflicts in the world today. So this has been incredibly instructive. Kim Ghattas, thank you so much. This is a great way for us to end our series for this year. Wish you well, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Freda, as well. I see that she was one of the questioners. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for those putting in comments in the Q&A as well, to say thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, an honor to speak to you, and I hope to have the occasion to come and visit in person sometime in the future.
Well, we hope so too. Thank you, and thank you everybody for listening out there. We hope to see you at the next events at UMD. All right, good night.
Good night, thank you.